Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode. In this one, I'm going to be talking about the college football rankings, which the latest rankings came out last week. There's not much change in them from last week to this week, as the top 10 stayed the same. And really, if you look at them, most of it didn't change much. Teams like Central Florida, Syracuse, Florida, etc., they all moved up like one spot because Kentucky lost, and Kentucky was 11th. So they dropped to 17. So there was some shifting there. Teams that are in like the 20-25 range doesn't have too much effect unless Central Florida were to lose. Then it could create some controversy on who's the best group of 5 school that gets to play in the New Year's Six. So that could create some controversy. Basically, the purpose of this video, which will probably be the last one until the conference championship games, which are still 2 weeks away, is going to be just highlighting, the most important games that are left on the schedule so far, the current top 10 and where each team sits, who I believe is still alive, and then I'll close it off with the chaos scenarios and the scenarios that the committee does not want to have to deal with should they arise. There's 5 of them. But first, let me just start by saying that if the 4 teams that are currently in the top 4, if they win out, they're in. And unfortunately, that wouldn't create any chaos, which isn't very much fun for sports fans because it leaves less debate. But if they win out their final 2 to 3 games, they'll be in. So just to recap the current top 10 that you have so far this week, you have Ohio State, who is sitting there at number 10 with 1 loss. That 1 loss was a blowout loss to Purdue. Number 9, you have West Virginia, whose only loss is to Iowa State, who is currently in the top 15, I believe. 16. They're 16th currently. And that was a close one. I believe they only lost by about 3 points. Number 8, you have Washington State, the lone Pac-12 team, who is carrying the hopes of the Pac-12 entirely on their shoulders. Their only loss currently was to USC by 3 points back in September. Number 7, you have LSU, the only 2-loss team in the top 10. Actually, the only 2-loss team in the top 11. And they have 2 losses on the year. They lost at home against Alabama convincingly, as you all remember. It was 29-0. And they also lost to Florida earlier in the season, back in late September, I believe it was. I believe it was like that final weekend of September. Number 6, you have Oklahoma, who currently has 1 loss, and that 1 loss was to Texas. Late in the game, they lost by 3 points. Number 5, you have Georgia, whose only loss is to LSU, so that's kind of a good loss for them, considering LSU is 7th, so it's not that bad of a loss. Michigan is number 4, so they're currently in. Their only loss is to Notre Dame. Notre Dame is sitting at 3rd. They're undefeated, and obviously have that signature win over Michigan. Clemson is number 2. They are also undefeated. And then Alabama is still number 1, as they have been throughout the entire process. So I'll move into who I think is still alive to make the playoff so far, or left. There's only really 9 teams. You can make an argument for 10 possibly, but I think it's really only 9. I say 10 because, if Syracuse were to beat Notre Dame, I think that catapults them into the top 10, then I believe. They would jump past Central Florida, who's 11. They would jump past Ohio State, who's 10. Maybe even West Virginia and Washington State. I'm not entirely sure. They are a 2-loss team, but their 2 losses on the year aren't terrible. One of their losses was to Clemson, who they played really tough. Unfortunately, couldn't pull it out at the end. But then they do have a really bad loss to Pitt, which was by 7. So that could linger over them in a sense, and it'll probably... The loss to Pitt is what's going to keep Syracuse out probably, but you never know. Because if the chaos scenarios, which I'll get to later, occur, you could see a lot of teams shift up and down. Next, working my way from the bottom of the list up to the top, is Ohio State. Ohio State, like I mentioned, has 1 loss to Purdue, but they still control their own destiny. They have another Big Ten game this week. I believe they played Maryland, so they should win that. And then next week they'll play Michigan, obviously in their annual rivalry game. So, and coincidentally, we'll get to that in a little bit as well. But if Ohio State were to win those 2 games and then win the Big Ten championship, you would have them obviously with a strong case being a conference champion and they would have some signature wins down the stretch because Northwestern, who has already clinched it from the Big Ten West, is in the Big Ten championship game, and they do have 3 losses on the year, but they're not terrible losses, I believe. West Virginia is still in it. Like I mentioned, they only have 1 loss, and it was to Iowa State, who's in the top 25. They still control their own destiny. Obviously, they have a Big 12 game this weekend. They should win it, though, because I believe they're playing like a Baylor or someone who isn't that great this year. And then they play Oklahoma next week, which I'll get to a little bit later. And then they may end up playing Oklahoma again in the Big 12 championship because those 2 teams are so far from the rest of the Big 12. Washington State, the lone Pac-12 team, carrying the entire hopes of them on their shoulders. They have 1 loss. If they were to lose again, the Pac-12 will be out of the playoff entirely. Again, deservedly so because they just beat up on everyone. One week you'll see Oregon beat Stanford. The next week USC will beat Oregon, and then UCLA will beat USC, and Stanford will beat UCLA, and then Washington will beat. You get my point. Everyone just keeps beating each other. So there's no real way for anyone to pull ahead of them. Washington State has been able to do it so far, but if they lose again, they're probably going to be out. So that's that. Oklahoma obviously is still in it. 1 loss like West Virginia. They do have a slightly better resume at this point so far, and their offense is a bit better than West Virginia's because they're a little more explosive in my opinion. Obviously, the big problem with Oklahoma, and it was mentioned this past week on the ranking show, is their defense. Their defense, for as great as their offense is, their defense is lackluster at best. It's not like they got a D-line like Clemson's or Mississippi State's, or they got some defensive backs like Ohio State, or they got linebackers galore, They got good players, but the problem is they give up too many points. Against Texas, they gave up 45. Oklahoma State, they gave up, 40-something as well. They've been giving up points in galore throughout the year. Actually, if you take a look at what they have given up in conference so far, take a look here. They gave up 27 to TCU, which isn't bad. 14 to Kansas State isn't bad, but they gave up 46 to Texas Tech, 47 to Oklahoma State. Like I said, 45 to Texas. Baylor, who's really not good, they gave up 33 to. They gave up 27 to Iowa State. The least amount of points they've given up so far this year is 14, and that's to Kansas State and Florida Atlantic. I mean, it's not really good in terms of a defense. It's just piss poor. I'm sorry, but it is. Georgia, obviously still alive. Their only loss is to number 7, and they're already in the SEC championship game, so they obviously could get a massive win over Alabama, who still has to play, obviously, them, which also leads you into Alabama, who is obviously alive because they're in it right now. And like I said, if they win out, they're in. And I'll get to, the potential of them losing in a bit. Alabama, they're playing the Citadel this week, so that's a W. But they also play Auburn next week, which is a rivalry game, but it's being played at home. So you got to figure, Tua and the rest of Alabama starters will come out after they're up 45-0 at halftime on the Citadel, and they're going to rest up for Auburn. Clemson, obviously, is still alive. They're undefeated, control their own destiny in the ACC because they should make the ACC championship, I believe, because even if they lost their next 2 in conference, they still own the tiebreaker over Syracuse. So they'll be in the conference championship as well. Control their own destiny. Notre Dame, obviously, is undefeated, so they control their own destiny as well. And also Michigan. Only loss of the year is to number 3 Notre Dame. So they, obviously, are still alive as well. So there's really 9 teams you could say they're alive. Maybe 10 with Syracuse if a lot of chaos happens, which I'll get to in a bit. But that's kind of it. I left out LSU, who's currently number 7, the only team in the top 10, because they have 2 losses, and I don't see a 2-loss team getting in this year. I'll mention it in a little bit as well. And plus, they can't get a conference championship. A conference championship in the committee's eyes is a differentiator. So let's say you got 2 teams you're trying to decide between. All right, say you're trying to decide between a Georgia and a Michigan, okay? Georgia wins their conference championship, but Michigan didn't. So, and they both get like 2 losses, because say Georgia slips up, okay? And other chaos happens. So if they need to figure out who that 4th slot is between Georgia and Michigan, the tiebreaker they would use is conference championship. Georgia won it, so they're in. That's how the committee views their stuff. Doesn't always mean that, you get in. As you've seen in years past, Ohio State didn't win their conference championship, but they got in. Albeit they did lose then pretty badly to Clemson. I believe it was 2 years ago. They lost to Clemson pretty bad. And then Alabama, believe it was last year. They had 1 loss, and they still got in, but they didn't win their conference championship because I believe it was Auburn got in ahead of them because they lost to Auburn. Don't quite remember, but again, you don't have to win the conference championship to get in, i.e. Notre Dame isn't in a conference, so they can't physically win a conference championship to have a differentiator. Hence why Notre Dame is always the biggest wild card every year with these playoff rankings. Moving along into the third subject of this video, I'm going to talk about the most important games that are left this season. I think there's really 6. Keep in mind, every game that a top 10 team is playing against is a big game because, if they were to slip up, it's going to create madness. But I'm going to make this video assuming that, Alabama doesn't lose to the Citadel, or Alabama's going to beat Auburn. Clemson's not going to lose to whoever they're playing in their final game of the regular season, Having said all that, there's one game that is probably the most important this week. And I was actually a little surprised College Game Day decided not to go there. Maybe they were too scared to go back after Boston College and Clemson in the cold last week, and they said we need to get back down to some warm weather. Typical Southern people, they can't play up north. They get too scared of the cold. And that is Notre Dame against number 12 Syracuse. I believe Notre Dame is considered the home team for the game since it's centered around some Irish tradition. So Notre Dame Irish, they're the home team, I believe. It's being played at Yankee Stadium. That's really the only game I see as very important this week because I think Notre Dame should be able to beat USC pretty handily, even though it's at USC. They already went to the West Coast this year, and they played San Diego State, and they played Navy, actually, I think, in San Diego as well. And they beat both of them pretty handily. So I don't think they'll have a problem with USC. It's a rivalry game, so USC will come out fired up and ready to play. But I think Syracuse presents a more challenge than expected because they have some great wins. They've been playing really well. It's at a neutral site, which obviously is important. And this could be the telltale sign. If Notre Dame were to lose a game, I think it would be this week, put it that way, which I'll also get to in a little bit of the chaos. Moving along next week, an important game also could be Syracuse versus Boston College. If Syracuse were to beat Notre Dame this week, I personally don't think they will. I think Notre Dame's going to run the table and win all their games. But nonetheless, Notre Dame versus Syracuse this week is still very important. And if Syracuse were to beat Notre Dame this week, it would add intrigue and pressure on Syracuse versus Boston College next week because it means Syracuse could potentially make some noise. They won't get to the conference championship because Clemson is going to be in it from their division, but they might take a spot in a New Year's Six Bowl from another team or wreak some havoc and eliminate some teams come next week. So if Syracuse moved up to, like, say, 8, then we could eliminate 3 or 4 other teams from potentially being in the playoff. There's no other games this week. Just keep in mind these last 3 games are all for the following week after Thanksgiving because this week every team in the SEC challenges or pays, $5,000, $10,000 for a team like a Liberty or FAU or UAB to come to their stadium and get blown out by 30, 40, 50 points. So there's no real other games this week, but the last 3 I want to mention are all rivalry games. Number 6 Oklahoma versus number 9 West Virginia. That's very important because they're likely going to be the 2 teams that play in the Big 12 championship as well, and it's coincidence that they're playing on the final week of the regular season. And I'll mention that as well later on in the chaos scenarios, but that's obviously a very important game with regards to how many losses you have as a conference champion. The other one is going to be number 4 Michigan versus number 10 Ohio State. Again, because if Michigan wins, they control their own destiny. They're in the Big Ten championship. They can get in very easily. If Ohio State were to win, I'll mention it again in a couple of minutes. But if Ohio State were to win, it adds a very impressive win to their resume, and it creates a lot of controversy as to who is supposed to get in. And then the final one is the Apple Cup, which features number 8 Washington State against number 18 Washington. Now you're saying, well, Washington's not in it, so what does that matter? It matters because if Washington State were to lose, the Pac-12 is out of the playoff entirely. If they were to win, it's obviously a very quality win, and it could move them up in the standings if a Notre Dame were to lose this week, or Georgia were to lose in the SEC championship, or Michigan were to lose. It could bolster and move them up, potentially get them even closer then. And then if they won the Pac-12 championship, if more chaos happens, they could get in. But Washington State needs a lot of help, and it's going to be at the forefront in the Apple Cup when they play Washington, which I believe they are playing at home this year. Moving into the last part of this video, I'm going to talk about the chaos scenarios. There was a picture that was shared on ESPN and SportsCenter Instagram and social media not too long ago. I think it was yesterday or Monday, I believe it was shared on there, saying the possible chaos scenarios for the playoff committee. I reordered them in the order that I think provides the most chaos and the most debate for the committee, and what they're probably hoping doesn't happen. Because if these 5 scenarios or even one of them happen, it's going to make their job a lot harder. It makes it more fun for us because we don't have to decide on who gets in. We just share our opinions. But for them in deciding who the best 4 teams are, it creates a lot of problems. So the 5th chaos scenario, which, again, so I'm going 5 to 1. So 5 being, I feel, is the least important scenario. Number 5 is Ohio State winning the Big Ten. Reason being, currently Michigan's number 4, Ohio State's number 10. Assuming they both win this week, they'll likely be at the same spot next week, assuming everyone in the top 10 wins this week, which they should, with the exception of Notre Dame because they have number 12 Syracuse. It would add intrigue because it would mean Ohio State now is in the Big Ten championship as a one-loss team. And if they beat Northwestern, which they should, they could lose because Northwestern is playing really well. Obviously, a lot of people at ESPN are really happy about that. But if Ohio State were to go 11-1, they not only have 2 impressive wins on their resume, but they're also a conference champion, which is a lot of weight and significance for the playoff committee and what they view as important. And it would mean that loss to Purdue was like, okay, it happens. 1 week, it's almost irrelevant. It would be like if a couple years ago, I believe, Clemson lost to Pitt, and everyone thought, oh my God, Pitt's horrible. How could Clemson lose to Pitt? And then when they turned around and won everything, and it just became another fluke. But it would create some chaos because now you're making the argument, okay, we got to drop Michigan down to like 8. Ohio State would probably rise up to like number 7. And then if they win their conference championship and say Alabama beats Georgia and Notre Dame hasn't lost, then you're trying to figure out, okay, am I putting a one-loss Big Ten team in, or am I putting a one-loss Big 12 team in then? And, Ohio State beating Michigan and then beating Northwestern, you could argue, is more important than Oklahoma beating West Virginia twice, or West Virginia beating Oklahoma twice. So that's obviously a very, very important game, to say the least. It's one that's been circled. Game day is probably going to be there next week. It's been an important game all year, and everyone knows since the first playoff rankings came out that it's going to be a very important one. Moving along to the 4th most important, or chaos scenario, I should say, that is left, is if the Big 12 produces a 2-loss champion. And now I mentioned earlier, Oklahoma and West Virginia both have 1 loss. They will play each other, presuming they each have 1 loss still, on the final week of the regular season, which is the weekend after Thanksgiving. Those two teams will likely be in the conference championship for the Big 12 as well. So one of them is going to win the game the weekend after Thanksgiving. So if they go 1-1, meaning Oklahoma wins on Thanksgiving and then West Virginia wins the next week, or vice versa, West Virginia wins Thanksgiving, Oklahoma wins the next week, it means the Big 12 champ is going to be a 2-loss Big 12 champ. They're a conference champion, but they have 2 losses. But one of their losses, if you're Oklahoma, or if you're West Virginia, 2 of your losses are going to be to teams that are likely going to be finished in the top 15, which, in my opinion, is not that bad. You're losing 2 games to the top 15. It means you're scheduling quality opponents, and you're playing well, and it shouldn't be held against you. If you're Oklahoma, on the other hand, and you're a 2-loss, maybe it keeps you out because, like I said, there's been questions about your defense, and you have, not to mention, 2 losses, and one of them is to Texas, who everyone thought was back. They beat Oklahoma. They're back on the map. They're ranked high. They're like 10th in the country, and they've lost like 2 games in a row now. And they could potentially lose the third one because I believe they play Oklahoma State this week. So, obviously, that adds a lot of pressure to the committee because a 2-loss conference champ from the Big 12, especially if it's West Virginia, adds a lot of pressure on it. And like I said, who are you going to put in? A 2-loss Big 12 champ or a 1-loss Big 10 Ohio State? It's almost an impossible question to answer. But again, that only happens if Ohio State beats Michigan and West Virginia and Oklahoma split. Moving along to the third one, the most important team every year for the committee, Notre Dame. If Notre Dame were to finish 11-1, it creates one of the most hard controversies probably in all of sports. Why is that? Notre Dame's schedule isn't great this year. They have the win over Michigan, who's currently number 4, and say they lose to Syracuse, okay? They would have a lot of wins then, but then they beat USC. So lose to Syracuse, beat USC. They would have a lot of wins over name schools like Navy, San Diego State, Army, USC, Wake Forest, I know you might not think Wake Forest is great, but they're decent. And like I said, Notre Dame doesn't get to compete for a conference championship because they're independent. Maybe this would convince them to get into a conference. Not likely because they make hundreds of millions of dollars by being independent in football, and being in a conference would probably actually make them less money than it does being independent. But an 11-1 Notre Dame team, keep in mind. So, hypothetically, just pretend of it this way. Say Michigan beats Ohio State and wins the Big Ten. Clemson stays undefeated, Alabama stays undefeated. Those 3 teams are in. But now Alabama beat Georgia, so they're out. So you would logically think, okay, Notre Dame is still going to be in as a 1-loss team. But now what if I told you Oklahoma is a Big 12 champ with 1 loss? Create some controversy because Oklahoma has that deciding factor that we mentioned earlier about being a conference champion. Notre Dame can't get a conference championship. So how do you value that? And Notre Dame's best win is going to be over probably Syracuse and Michigan. Oklahoma will have quality wins over West Virginia and other Big 12 teams like Iowa State they beat. So it creates a lot of controversy for the committee. Or say Notre Dame loses to USC, who currently isn't ranked. Okay, now you got Oklahoma, who lost to Texas, who may not be ranked by the time the final rankings come out. And then you have Notre Dame, who lost to USC, who might not be ranked by the time the final rankings come out. It creates an unbalance. I feel Oklahoma would get the tip of the scale then just by that much. Just because I think their offense is a little more dominant than Notre Dame's is. I think Notre Dame, you could argue, is a more complete team, but the resume speaks for themselves, and their resume isn't stellar. Personally, though, it's close. I mean, right now I would say Oklahoma, but 2 weeks from now I might say Notre Dame because their offense is much better with Ian Book at quarterback than Brandon Wimbush, who was the quarterback when they beat Michigan. So just think about that. Notre Dame beat Michigan with their backup quarterback. Says a lot about Notre Dame, in my opinion. The second chaos scenario is if Clemson loses a game but wins the ACC. And you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, they're not going to lose a game. And I agree with you. I don't think Clemson is going to lose a game until potentially the playoffs, assuming they make it. But just hypothetically pretend they lose to South Carolina in their final week of the regular season, or they lose the ACC championship game to whoever they're going to play in that. I don't believe that's been decided yet. It creates a lot of controversy because maybe they're the conference champion, but they lost to South Carolina, and that's a terrible loss. And if you have to decide between Clemson and Notre Dame, okay, it's the same argument I just mentioned, you know. Say Michigan and Alabama are in, and say Oklahoma's in because they beat West Virginia twice. Okay, so you got 3 of the 4 decided, but how do you decide between Clemson and Notre Dame? Either Clemson and Notre Dame are both one loss, and they don't have a conference championship to decide between them, or Clemson is an ACC champ with one loss, and Notre Dame is a one-loss team with no conference championship. But maybe Clemson lost by more than Notre Dame did. It's hard to say. It really is. But Clemson losing would create a big problem for the committee. And then finally, the biggest chaos scenario that can possibly happen is if Alabama loses a close game to Georgia in the SEC championship. Again, this is presuming that Georgia and Alabama are both going to beat their cupcake teams this week. And then Alabama beats Auburn the next week, and Georgia beats Georgia Tech. So they both have, Bama has no losses, Georgia has one loss when they enter to play in the SEC championship game. Say Georgia wins 20-17, okay? So Alabama lost the game by 3 points. You know, Georgia played some stout defense. Alabama looked a little sloppy. And Georgia, you know, got a late field goal to win it, and Bama couldn't go down the field and score. All right, just say they lose by 3 points. Or say they lose by a touchdown even. Say the rest of the teams win out, okay? So if Clemson, Notre Dame, and Michigan all win out, okay? Clemson would probably be number 1. And then, actually, I don't know who would be in there in Notre Dame and Michigan. But say Georgia beats Alabama. Okay, well, Georgia just beat Alabama, so they have to be in. So Clemson's in, Georgia's in. Now you have 3 teams to decide between. Undefeated Notre Dame or potentially one-loss Notre Dame, a one-loss Michigan, who's the conference champion, or a one-loss Alabama, who isn't a conference champion, but let's be honest, they're probably the most complete team in football. It's not the best defense Saban has had at Alabama, but it's easily the best offense. And personally, I would take Alabama's offense before I would take Oklahoma's. So that creates an endless controversy. I mean, listen, I could go on for another 30 minutes talking about how important that Bama-Georgia would be. But let me put it to you this way. Say Georgia were to win, in my opinion, and the rest of the teams win now, okay? This would be my top 4. Clemson 1, Notre Dame 2, Georgia would be 3, and Alabama would be 4. I think if that were to happen, Michigan would get bumped, even as a one-loss conference champion. Mainly because I truly feel that if Alabama and Michigan played, Alabama would win, and it would not be close, like within 7 points on neutral field. Because again, remember, all the playoff games and championship games are played down south, which favor Alabama and every SEC team to ever play, because they don't have to worry about the weather or conditions. They never do. And if you don't believe me, look up the last time Auburn went above the Mason-Dixon line. I don't think it's been in the past 35 years. And I think there's another team in the SEC. I can't recall who. I think it's not LSU. I want to say Auburn, maybe. Hasn't gone above the Mason-Dixon line. There's a team in the SEC that hasn't gone above the Mason-Dixon line since like the 70s or 60s. Or they spent 50 years between it. So the SEC never goes north because they don't like to play in 40-degree weather. Next thing you know, they'll be complaining that, we need more dome stadiums to play in to protect the players or something, which is baloney. But again, that would be my top 4 if Georgia were to beat Alabama. So we'll be back in 2 weeks, though, to look at this more. I'll talk more about college football. Be sure to go follow my channel or subscribe to it, or check out the videos that I post here on social media to hear more about it. Feel free to give me a call or message me and give me your takes on it as well. I'm always open to them. I'll be back in 2 weeks, though, with my next college football one, because by that point, a lot of those important games that I mentioned up to you already will have been decided and done, and we'll know all the conference championships. Some of the current top 10 won't be in the top 10 anymore. Who's alive and who's not alive could be down from 9 or 10 teams down to like 6 teams. And the chaos scenarios could be dwindled because maybe Ohio State won't win the Big Ten because they beat Michigan. Maybe Notre Dame isn't going to finish 11-1 because they went 12-0. Maybe Clemson isn't going to lose to South Carolina. Stuff like that will already have been decided. And we can talk about it more. I may have a guest on to talk about it as well. We'll see. Hope everyone has a good day. Shout out to my hometown. They're in the sectional final Friday night against Irvington. And then we have our annual game on Thanksgiving. Go Liners, and enjoy some college football.